The gunshot echoed across the dusty town of Silverspring, Colorado, but Grace Nichols didn't flinch. After surviving the fire that had claimed her family home and left half her face scarred, little could startle her anymore. It was 1878, and Grace had spent the last 3 years enduring the whispers, the stares, and the cruel laughter that followed her through town like an unwelcome shadow. Today was no different as she made her way down the main street toward the general store, the morning sun beating down mercilessly on her worn cotton dress. "Look who's decided to grace us with her presence," a woman's voice called out, followed by tittering laughter from the group gathered outside the millinery shop. Grace kept her gaze fixed ahead, clutching her basket tighter as the whispers grew louder. She had learned to steel herself against their words, but that didn't mean they didn't cut deep. At 22, she had resigned herself to a life of solitude, working as a seamstress from the small room she rented above the livery stable. As she approached the general store, the doors of the saloon across the street swung open. A tall figure emerged, adjusting his hat against the glare of the sun. Blake Foster had arrived in Silverspring just last week, bringing with him rumors of heroic deeds and a mysterious past. His presence had set the town abuzz with speculation, particularly among the unmarried women who found his rugged good looks and quiet demeanor irresistible. Grace tried to make herself smaller as she passed the group of women, but one of them, Harriet Wilson, stepped directly into her path. "Why do you even bother coming into town?" Harriet asked, her voice dripping with disdain. "You know you frighten the children with that face." The others laughed, and Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. She attempted to step around them, but another woman blocked her way. "Maybe she thinks that new Cowboy might take a shine to her," someone suggested, prompting more laughter. "I just need supplies," Grace said quietly, her voice barely audible above their taunts. Blake Foster had just secured his horse to the hitching post when he heard the commotion. He turned to see a group of women surrounding someone. From where he stood, he could only make out a slender figure in a faded blue dress, head bowed under the weight of their mockery. Without thinking, he crossed the street, the spurs on his boots jingling with each purposeful step. As he drew closer, the women's laughter died down, replaced by hopeful smiles as they noticed his approach. "Ladies," he said, tipping his hat as he moved past them. The circle parted, revealing Grace standing there, her long chestnut hair partially covering the right side of her face where angry red scars twisted from her cheek down her neck, disappearing beneath her high collar. Grace lifted her gaze, meeting Blake's eyes for just a moment before looking away. In that brief connection, he saw something that struck him deeply, not just pain, but a quiet strength that he recognized all too well. The women watched expectantly, clearly anticipating that Blake would join in their cruel amusement, or at the very least, retreat from the sight of Grace's scars. Instead, Blake removed his hat completely, holding it respectfully against his chest. "Madam," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "Would you allow me to assist you with your shopping today?" Harriet's mouth fell open. "Mr. Foster, surely you don't—" "I was speaking to the lady," Blake interrupted, his tone polite but firm as he kept his eyes on Grace. Grace stared at him, confusion evident in her expression. No one in town had ever offered her kindness so openly, let alone a stranger and certainly not a man as handsome as Blake Foster. I can manage," she stammered, unsure how to respond to this unexpected turn of events. Blake nodded respectfully but didn't move away. "I have some purchases to make myself. Perhaps we could save each other some time." The women watched in disbelief as Blake extended his arm to Grace. She hesitated, suspecting some cruel joke, but something in his steady gaze convinced her of his sincerity. As Grace reluctantly placed her hand on his arm, Blake leaned closer and said in a voice meant only for her, "I see beauty where others are too blind to look." Grace's step faltered and she looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of mockery. Finding none, she allowed him to escort her into the store, leaving the stunned group of women on the boardwalk behind them. Inside the general store, the proprietor, Mr. Collins, looked up in surprise at the unlikely pair. Blake nodded a greeting while Grace kept her eyes down, acutely aware of the stares from the few other customers. "What do you need to purchase today?" Blake asked, his voice casual as if escorting a scarred woman through town was something he did every day. "Just some thread and fabric," Grace replied softly, "and flour." As they moved through the store collecting items, Blake maintained a steady stream of polite conversation, asking about the town and its surroundings. His matter-of-fact manner gradually eased some of Grace's tension. "Have you lived in Silverspring long?" he asked as she examined spools of thread. "All my life," she answered, selecting a spool of blue thread that matched her dress. "Though sometimes it feels like I'm still a stranger here," Blake nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Towns have long memories and short sight," he commented cryptically. As Mr. Collins tallied their purchases, Grace reached for her small purse, but Blake placed his hand gently on her arm. "Allow me," he said. "No," she replied firmly, surprising herself with her conviction. "Thank you, but no, I pay my own way." A smile touched Blake's lips, and he inclined his head in respect. "As you wish." After they had paid, Blake carried their packages out onto the boardwalk. The group of women had dispersed, but Grace could feel eyes watching from various storefronts. "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Foster," she said, reaching for her parcels. "But you needn't feel obligated to." "Blake," he interrupted, "and there's no obligation, Miss." Grace Nichols, Miss Nichols," he said, tipping his hat once more. "Would you permit me to walk you home?" "These packages look heavy." Grace studied him, still wary of his intentions. Men didn't offer assistance to women like her without ulterior motives, yet she detected no hint of deception in his clear blue eyes. "I live above the livery," she said finally. "It's not far." They walked in silence for a few moments, the sounds of the busy street filling the space between them. Grace was acutely aware of the curious and disapproving glances directed their way. "You're new to town," she observed, finally breaking the silence. Blake nodded. "Arrived last week." "I'm working for the Rockingham Ranch, breaking horses for Tom Miller." "I know the Millers," Grace replied. "Mrs. Miller sometimes brings me mending work." As they approached the livery stable, Grace became increasingly nervous. This unexpected interaction had been pleasant, but experience had taught her that kindness often came with a price. "This is where I live," she said, stopping at the side entrance that led to the stairs up to her room. "Thank you again, Mr. Foster Blake." Blake handed her the packages but didn't immediately turn to leave. Instead, he studied her face openly, his gaze not avoiding her scars as most people did. "May I call on you sometime, Miss Nichols?" he asked, the question so unexpected that Grace nearly dropped her parcels. "Call on me." She repeated, certain she had misheard. "Yes, perhaps we could take a walk on Sunday after church." Grace clutched her packages tighter. "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Blake didn't seem offended by her directness. "Because I'd like to know you better," he said simply. "Is this some kind of wager?" Grace asked, her voice hardening. "Did someone put you up to this?" A flash of something hurt perhaps crossed Blake's face. "No, Miss Nichols, I don't make sport of people's feelings." Grace searched his face, looking for any sign of deceit. Finding none, she still couldn't bring herself to believe his interest was genuine. "I don't attend church," she said finally. "Not anymore," Blake nodded, accepting this without question. "Then perhaps I could visit here tomorrow evening." Grace hesitated. Common sense told her to refuse, to protect herself from inevitable disappointment or humiliation. But a small part of her, a part she thought had died in the fire along with her family, stirred with something like hope. "Very well," she said at last. "Tomorrow evening." Blake smiled then, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his serious face. "Until tomorrow, Miss Nichols." As he walked away, Grace climbed the stairs to her room, her mind whirling with questions and doubts. She placed her packages on the small table and moved to the window, watching as Blake strode back toward the main street, his tall figure easily distinguishable among the townspeople. What could a man like him possibly want with her? Men had approached her before, but always with crude propositions or cruel jokes. None had ever asked to call on her properly. Grace touched her scarred cheek, feeling the rough, puckered skin beneath her fingertips. She had accepted long ago that love and marriage were not in her future. Yet Blake Foster's words echoed in her mind. I see beauty where others are too blind to look. Could he possibly mean it, or would tomorrow bring only disappointment and fresh pain? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the dusty town of Silverspring, Grace allowed herself something she hadn't felt in years, a flicker of hope. The following day passed in a blur of anticipation and dread for Grace. She worked mechanically on her sewing, her fingers moving by habit while her mind repeatedly returned to Blake Foster and his unexpected invitation. By late afternoon, she had convinced herself he wouldn't come, that yesterday's kindness had been a momentary impulse he now regretted. When a knock sounded on her door just after 6 o'clock, Grace nearly pricked her finger with her needle. She set aside the shirt she was mending and smoothed down her dress, the same faded blue one she'd worn yesterday, as she had few others. She had washed her hair that morning and arranged it carefully to cover as much of her scarred cheek as possible without appearing to hide. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door to find Blake standing there, hat in hand. He wore a clean white shirt under a dark vest and his hair was still damp from washing. "Good evening, Miss Nichols," he said, his deep voice filling the small landing outside her door. "Mr. Foster," she replied, surprised that he had actually come. "Please come in." Her room was small but tidy, with a narrow bed against one wall, a table with 2 chairs, a small stove, and a washstand. Her sewing materials were neatly arranged on the table, and a bookshelf held her modest collection of books treasures salvaged from the fire. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work," Blake said, glancing at the shirt she'd been mending. "Not at all," Grace assured him, gesturing to one of the chairs. "Please sit down. Would you like some tea?" Blake accepted her offer, and as Grace busied herself preparing the tea, she felt his eyes on her. Not on her scars, as most people's were, but on her movements, her hands, her whole self. "You have a lot of books," he observed, looking at her small collection. Grace nodded, pouring hot water into the teapot. "Reading takes me away from here sometimes, to places where no one knows me or how I look." Blake accepted the cup she offered him. "What happened, if you don't mind my asking?" The directness of his question startled her. Most people gossiped about her scars behind her back but never dared to ask her directly. "A fire," she said after a moment, sitting down across from him. 3 years ago, our house burned down in the middle of the night. I managed to get out, but—" She trailed off, the memories still too painful to articulate fully. "Your family?" Blake asked gently. Grace shook her head, looking down at her tea. "I was the only one who survived." Blake's expression remained composed, but his eyes reflected genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Grace replied, appreciating that he didn't offer empty platitudes or religious consolations as so many had done. "Is that why you don't attend church anymore?" he asked, connecting her earlier comment. Grace nodded. "After the fire, everyone said it was God's will, that everything happens for a reason. I couldn't understand what reason could justify my parents and my little brother burning to death while I lived." Blake was quiet for a moment, sipping his tea. "I understand that feeling," he said finally. "I stopped attending church after the war, saw too many good men die for no reason I could fathom." "You fought in the war?" Grace asked, grateful for the shift in conversation. "Yes, for the Union. I was young, just 18 when I enlisted in '63. Too young to understand what I was getting into." For the next hour, they talked easily, moving from topic to topic. Blake told her about growing up in Pennsylvania, about his time in the Army, and his years drifting westward after the war, working as a ranch hand and occasionally as a lawman. Grace found herself sharing stories of her childhood in Silverspring, of her father who had been the town doctor and her mother who had taught her to sew. "Is that how you learned your trade?" Blake asked, gesturing toward her sewing materials. Grace nodded. "My mother was a fine seamstress. She taught me everything she knew. After the fire, it was the only way I could support myself." As the evening wore on, Grace realized she felt comfortable with Blake in a way she hadn't felt with anyone since before the fire. He looked at her when he spoke to her, truly looked at her, not at her scars or at some point over her shoulder as most people did. When Blake finally rose to leave, Grace found herself reluctant to see him go. "Thank you for the tea and conversation, Miss Nichols," he said, placing his hat back on his head. "Thank you for coming," she replied, meaning it sincerely. At the door, Blake turned back to her. "Would it be too forward of me to ask if I might call on you again?" Grace hesitated only briefly. "I would like that." A smile spread across Blake's face. "How about a picnic on Sunday? There's a nice spot by the creek just outside of town." The thought of being seen in public with Blake made Grace nervous, but his hopeful expression was difficult to resist. "All right," she agreed. "A picnic." "I'll come for you at noon," he said, tipping his hat. "Good night, Miss Nichols." "Good night, Mr. Foster." After he left, Grace sat back down at her table, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. Part of her was elated that a man like Blake Foster had sought out her company and seemed to genuinely enjoy it. Another part, the cautious part that had protected her these past 3 years, warned her not to trust too easily or hope too much. As she prepared for bed, Grace caught her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand. The scars that twisted down the right side of her face seemed especially prominent in the lamplight. How could Blake look past them when they were all she saw when she looked at herself? Yet his words from yesterday echoed in her mind. "I see beauty where others are too blind to look." For the first time in 3 years, Grace allowed herself to wonder if perhaps someone could see more in her than just her scars. Sunday arrived with clear skies and warm sunshine, perfect weather for a picnic. Grace had spent the morning preparing, washing her hair again and choosing her best dress, a light green cotton with small white flowers that her mother had made for her before the fire. It was slightly outdated now, but Grace had carefully altered it to fit her current figure. She'd also baked a small apple pie using precious ingredients from her limited stores. It felt important to contribute something to their outing, to show Blake that she wasn't just accepting his kindness passively. As noon approached, Grace grew increasingly nervous. What if Blake had changed his mind? Or what if this whole thing was some elaborate joke, and he was at this moment laughing about her with his friends at the saloon? But precisely at noon, a knock came at her door. When she opened it, Blake stood there with a picnic basket in one hand and a small bouquet of wildflowers in the other. "These are for you," he said, offering her the flowers. "I picked them on my way into town." Grace accepted them with surprise. "Thank you, they're beautiful." She quickly found a jar to use as a vase, arranging the colorful blooms before grabbing her shawl and the pie she had baked. "You made a pie?" Blake asked, looking impressed. "Apple," Grace confirmed. "I thought I should contribute something to our picnic." Blake's smile widened. "That was thoughtful of you. I'm not much of a cook myself. Mrs. Miller at the ranch packed some chicken and biscuits for us." As they left the livery stable and walked through town, Grace was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. She kept her head down, letting her hair fall forward to shield her face, but Blake walked tall beside her, seemingly oblivious to the attention they were attracting. They passed Harriet Wilson and her friends outside the church, and Grace heard their hushed conversation stop abruptly. Blake nodded politely to the women but didn't slow his pace. "People are staring," Grace murmured as they reached the edge of town. "Let them," Blake replied simply. "It's not our concern what they think." The spot Blake had chosen for their picnic was indeed lovely, a grassy area beneath a large cottonwood tree by the creek, far enough from town to afford them privacy, but not so remote as to be improper. Blake spread a blanket on the ground and began unpacking the food while Grace arranged the plates and cups he had brought. The domesticity of the scene struck her suddenly. How long had it been since she'd shared a meal outdoors with someone? Not since before the fire, certainly. "This is a beautiful spot," she commented, looking around at the wildflowers dotting the grass and the clear water of the creek bubbling past. "I found it earlier this week," Blake said, setting out the food. "I thought you might appreciate some peace away from town." They ate companionably, talking about inconsequential things: the weather, the food, the wildlife they observed. After they finished the main course, Grace served her apple pie, watching anxiously as Blake took his first bite. "This is delicious," he declared after tasting it. "Did your mother teach you to bake as well as sew?" Grace nodded, pleased by his reaction. "She did. She believed a woman should be skilled in all aspects of running a household." "Your mother was a wise woman," Blake said, taking another bite. "My own mother was similar." She made sure all of us, even my brothers, knew how to cook and mend our clothes before we left home. You have brothers? Grace asked, realizing how little she still knew about him. Two, Blake confirmed, both older. They're still back east, one working in our father's carpentry shop, the other a schoolteacher in Philadelphia. As the afternoon wore on, they moved to sit with their backs against the trunk of the cottonwood tree. The conversation flowed easily between them, and Grace found herself relaxing more than she had in years. Blake had a gift for storytelling, and his tales of his travels across the Western Territories after the war had her alternately laughing and gasping in surprise. "What brought you to Silverspring?" she asked eventually. "It's not exactly on the main routes west." Blake was quiet for a moment, his expression becoming more serious. "I was looking for somewhere quiet, somewhere I could maybe put down roots after years of drifting. And have you found it?" Grace asked softly. "What you were looking for?" Blake turned to look at her, his blue eyes intent. "I'm beginning to think I might have." The weight of his gaze made Grace's heart beat faster. She looked away, down at her hands folded in her lap. "May I ask you something, Miss Nichols?" Blake said after a moment, "Of course." "Why do you stay in Silverspring? The people here treat you poorly. Surely there are other towns where you could practice your trade without such cruelty." The question caught Grace off guard. She had asked herself the same thing many times over the past 3 years. "This is home," she said finally. "Even with everything that's happened, it's the only home I've ever known. My parents and brother are buried here. And—" She hesitated, then continued, "And I suppose part of me believes that if I left, it would be like letting them win, letting them drive me away because of how I look now." Blake nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. "That takes courage," he said, "staying where it's hardest." "Not courage," Grace corrected him. "Stubbornness, perhaps, or fear of the unknown." "I think you're braver than you give yourself credit for," Blake insisted gently. They fell into a comfortable silence, watching the play of light through the leaves above them. The afternoon was waning, the sun beginning its descent toward the western horizon. "We should probably head back soon," Grace said reluctantly. "It will be getting dark before long." Blake agreed, and they packed up their picnic things. As they walked back toward town, Blake carried the basket in one hand and, after a moment's hesitation, offered his other arm to Grace. She placed her hand lightly on his forearm, the gesture feeling both formal and intimate at the same time. As they approached the edge of town, Grace could feel her tension returning. The peaceful bubble of their afternoon was about to be pierced by the reality of Silverspring's judgment. "Thank you for today," she said, wanting to express her gratitude before they were back among prying eyes. It was the most pleasant day I've had in a very long time." Blake looked down at her, his expression warm. "For me as well, Miss Nichols." They walked in silence through the mostly empty Sunday streets. Most people were still at home after church services, but those few who were out watched their progress with undisguised interest. At the stairs to her room, Blake set down the picnic basket and turned to face her. "May I call on you again this week?" he asked. Grace nodded, surprised by how much she wanted to see him again. "I would like that." Blake's smile was warm as he took her hand and raised it briefly to his lips in a gesture that seemed to belong to another time and place. "Until then, Miss Nichols," he said, releasing her hand. "Until then, Mr. Foster," she replied, her voice soft. As she climbed the stairs to her room, Grace felt a lightness in her step that had been absent for years. She knew the gossip about her and Blake would be all over town by morning, but for once, she found she didn't care what people might say. For the first time since the fire, Grace had experienced a perfect day, a day not defined by her scars or by loss, but by connection and simple joy. Whatever came next, she would have this day to remember. Inside her room, Grace placed the remaining wildflowers Blake had given her in the center of her small table. Their bright colors stood out against the plain surroundings, much like the hope now blooming unexpectedly in her heart. The next week brought a steady rhythm to Grace's life that she hadn't experienced in years. Blake called on her every evening after finishing his work at the ranch, sometimes bringing small gifts, more wildflowers, a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy, or sweet candies from the general store. They would talk for hours, sharing stories and opinions, discovering their common interests and good-naturedly debating their differences. On Wednesday evening, Blake arrived looking more serious than usual. "Is something wrong?" Grace asked as she poured him a cup of tea. Blake accepted the cup but set it aside untasted. "There's talk in town," he said directly. "About us," Grace nodded, unsurprised. "I expected as much. What are they saying?" "Various things. That I'm courting you out of pity, that there must be something wrong with me to be interested in." He hesitated. "In someone who looks like me," Grace finished for him, her voice steady despite the pain his words caused. "And what do you think about that?" Blake's blue eyes met hers without wavering. "I think people see only what they expect to see. They look at you and see only scars. They look at me and see only a drifter who doesn't know his own mind." He reached across the table and took her hand in his. "But I know what I see, Grace. I see a woman of remarkable strength and grace. I see intelligence and kindness. And yes, I see beauty not despite your scars, but including them. They're part of who you are, part of your story." Grace felt tears prickling behind her eyes at his words. No one had spoken to her this way since the fire, as if she were still whole, still worthy of admiration. "Blake," she began, not sure what she wanted to say. "I'm not courting you out of pity," he continued, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "I'm courting you because in the short time I've known you, I've come to care for you deeply. And I'd like your permission to continue doing so, regardless of what anyone in this town might say." The tears Grace had been holding back spilled over. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'd like that very much." Blake's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. From that evening on, their relationship deepened. They began to take walks together through town in the evenings, Blake proudly escorting Grace on his arm despite the stares and whispers. Gradually, some of the townsfolk began to nod greetings to them, though others remained openly hostile. On Sunday, Blake surprised Grace by asking if she would accompany him to church. "You don't have to," he assured her, seeing her hesitation. "I know how you feel about it, but I thought perhaps, well, it might be good for both of us to try again, together." Grace considered his request. She hadn't set foot in the church since her family's funeral. The thought of facing the entire town, sitting among them while they stared and whispered, made her stomach knot with anxiety. "I don't know if I can," she admitted. Blake nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's all right. It was just a thought." But later that night, lying in her bed, Grace reconsidered. Blake had been nothing but supportive of her. He had stood by her side, facing the town's judgment without flinching. Perhaps it was time for her to be equally brave for him. The next morning, she put on her best dress and arranged her hair carefully. When Blake arrived to escort her to the livery for their planned ride into the countryside, he found her waiting in her Sunday best. "I'd like to go to church with you," she said before he could speak, "if the offer still stands." The look of joy that spread across Blake's face told her she had made the right decision. The walk to the church was the longest of Grace's life. With each step, she fought the urge to turn back, to retreat to the safety of her room. But Blake's steady presence beside her gave her strength. As they approached the white clapboard building, people milling outside fell silent, turning to stare at them. Grace kept her eyes forward, her hand tight on Blake's arm. "Miss Nichols," Reverend Thompson said, genuine surprise in his voice as they reached the steps. "It's been a long time since we've seen you here." "Yes, Reverend," Grace replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Mr. Foster invited me to join him today." "You're both most welcome," the Reverend said, recovering quickly. "Please come in." Inside, Blake led Grace to a pew near the back, away from the curious stares. As the service began, Grace found herself transported back to Sundays before the fire, sitting between her parents, her little brother fidgeting beside her, the familiar hymns and prayers washing over her. When the congregation rose to sing, Blake's deep voice joined in beside her. After a moment's hesitation, Grace began to sing too, her voice soft at first, then stronger. The music filled something in her that had been empty for too long. After the service, several people approached them. Some merely nodded politely, but others, including Mrs. Miller from the ranch where Blake worked, spoke kindly to Grace, asking after her health and her sewing business. "It's good to see you back, Grace," Mrs. Miller said warmly. It's been too long." As they walked back toward town, Grace felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "Thank you," she said to Blake, "for encouraging me to come today." Blake squeezed her hand. "Thank you for being brave enough to try." That evening, as they sat together on the small bench outside the livery, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, Blake turned to Grace with a serious expression. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice low. "Something about my past that you should know." Grace looked at him, concern growing at his tone. "What is it?" Blake took a deep breath. "After the war, I worked as a deputy marshal for a time in Kansas. There was an incident, a shootout with a gang of cattle rustlers." He paused, his face troubled. "I killed 2 men that day." Grace waited, sensing there was more to the story. "One of them was just a boy, barely 17, Blake continued, his voice rough with emotion. "He drew on me and I fired without thinking. It was only afterward that I realized how young he was." He looked down at his hands. "I left the marshal's office after that, couldn't bear to wear the badge anymore. I've been drifting ever since, working ranch jobs, trying to find some peace with what happened." Grace reached out and took his hand in hers. "Is that why you came to Silverspring, to escape those memories?" Blake nodded. "Partly, but I'm also tired of running from the past. I want to build something new, something good." In that moment, looking at this strong man made vulnerable by his honesty, Grace felt something shift inside her. The tentative feelings she had been nurturing burst into full bloom. She loved him, this kind, troubled man who had seen past her scars to the person beneath. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. Blake looked up, meeting her eyes. "I wanted you to know everything about me, no secrets between us." "No secrets," Grace agreed, and then, gathering her courage, she added, "Blake, I care for you. Very much." Blake's expression softened, and he reached up to gently touch her cheek, the scarred one, his fingers tracing the ridges with tenderness rather than revulsion. "I love you, Grace Nichols," he said simply. "I think I have since that first day when I saw you standing so proudly despite their cruelty." Grace's heart seemed to stop and then race forward. "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling strange and wonderful on her lips. Blake leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. But Grace moved toward him, and their lips met in a gentle kiss, her first since the fire, his first in longer than he could remember. When they parted, Blake kept his hand on her cheek, his eyes full of emotion. "I want to build a life with you, Grace. Not right away, we have time to know each other better, but someday if you'll have me." Grace covered his hand with her own. "Someday," she agreed, her heart fuller than she had ever thought possible again. As summer turned to autumn, Blake and Grace's courtship became the talk of Silverspring. Some still whispered and laughed behind their hands, but others began to see what Blake had seen from the beginning, the strength and beauty in Grace that transcended her scars. Blake continued working at the Rockingham Ranch, proving himself so valuable that Tom Miller offered him a permanent position as foreman. Meanwhile, Grace's sewing business flourished as more women in town, following Mrs. Miller's example, began to bring her their mending and commission new dresses. In October, Blake took Grace to meet Tom and Martha Miller properly. The Millers' ranch house was cozy and welcoming, with a large kitchen where Martha served them a hearty meal. "Blake tells us you're an excellent seamstress," Martha said as they sat around the table after dinner. Grace nodded, still somewhat shy around new people. "I enjoy the work." "I've been thinking," Martha continued, "the ranch hands are always needing shirts mended and such. And with winter coming, we could use some new curtains and quilts. Would you consider taking on work for the ranch on a regular basis?" Grace looked at Blake, who seemed as surprised as she was by the offer. "That would be wonderful, Mrs. Miller," Grace said. "Thank you, Martha, please," the older woman insisted. "And it's purely selfish on my part. My eyes aren't what they used to be for fine stitching." As they rode back to town that evening, Blake noticed Grace was unusually quiet. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Grace looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Just how much has changed in such a short time. A few months ago, I was alone, resigned to a life of isolation. Now," she turned to look at him, her expression soft in the twilight. "Now I have you and work I enjoy and people who treat me like a person again, not just a curiosity or an object of pity." Blake reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. "You've always been more than your scars, Grace. Some of us just needed to be reminded of that." As they reached the livery, Blake helped Grace down from her horse. Before letting her go, he held her close for a moment. "I have something to ask you," he said, his voice low and serious. Grace looked up at him, her heart quickening at his tone. "Tom Miller has offered me a piece of land on the edge of his property. A few acres with a creek running through it, not far from town. There's no house yet, but with winter coming, I could have one built by spring." He took both of her hands in his. "I know we haven't known each other long, but I love you, Grace. I want to marry you, to build a home and a life with you. Will you be my wife?" Grace felt tears filling her eyes, but for once they were tears of joy. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, Blake, I will marry you." Blake's face broke into a radiant smile. He lifted her off her feet in an embrace that spoke of all the happiness he felt, then set her down gently and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache with love. "When?" she asked when they finally parted. "As soon as the house is ready," Blake said. "In the spring." "Unless you'd prefer to wait longer," Grace shook her head. "Spring sounds perfect." That night, alone in her room, Grace stood before her small mirror, looking at her reflection with new eyes. The scars were still there, would always be there. But now, when she looked at herself, she saw what Blake saw, not just the marks of tragedy, but the signs of survival, of endurance. For the first time in 3 years, Grace smiled at her reflection, accepting all of herself, scars and all. Winter descended on Silverspring with a vengeance that year. Heavy snows blanketed the town and surrounding countryside, making travel difficult. Blake moved into a small cabin on the ranch to be closer to his work and the construction site of their future home, which meant he could only visit Grace on Sundays when the weather permitted. During those long winter months, Grace threw herself into preparations for their spring wedding and their new life together. She sewed curtains and quilts for their home, working by lamplight long into the evening. She also began to make her wedding dress, a project she kept carefully hidden whenever Blake visited. The townsfolk, seeing her devotion and Blake's steadfast love, gradually changed their attitude toward Grace. Women who had once mocked her now greeted her politely in the general store, and some even commissioned dresses from her for spring socials. Harriet Wilson, however, remained coldly hostile, refusing to acknowledge Grace when they passed on the street. Grace learned from Martha Miller that Harriet had set her sights on Blake when he first arrived in town and considered Grace's theft of his affections a personal affront. "Don't worry about her," Martha advised during one of Grace's visits to the ranch. "Some people can't see past their own noses." By February, the frame of Blake and Grace's house stood proudly on the piece of land Tom Miller had given them. Blake took Grace to see it one clear Sunday, the two of them riding through the snow-covered landscape to the construction site. "It's not much yet," Blake said as they stood looking at the wooden skeleton of what would be their home. "But by April, it should be finished." Grace walked through the outlined rooms, imagining where their furniture would go, where they would eat their meals, where they would sleep. The house wasn't large, but it was solidly built with a good-sized kitchen and a cozy parlor. Blake had even included a small room that could serve as Grace's sewing room. "It's perfect," she said, turning to him with shining eyes. "Our home." Blake pulled her into his arms, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Our home," he repeated, the words a promise. As they prepared to leave, Grace noticed a movement in the trees at the edge of their property. A figure on horseback was watching them from the shadow of the pines. "Blake," she said quietly, nodding toward the trees. Blake turned, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip. But the rider had already turned away, disappearing into the forest. "Probably just one of the ranch hands checking the fence line," Blake said, but his voice held a note of uncertainty that Grace hadn't heard before. That evening, as they sat by the fire in Grace's room sharing a simple meal, Blake seemed preoccupied. "Is something wrong?" Grace asked. Blake hesitated, then said, "There have been some strange happenings at the ranch lately. Cattle found far from their usual grazing areas, signs of riders on the property at night." "Do you think it's rustlers?" Grace asked, concern evident in her voice. "Maybe." Tom's increased the night patrols, but so far they haven't caught anyone. He shook his head as if to dismiss the topic. Don't worry, it's probably nothing. But later that week, word reached town that a small herd of cattle had been driven off from the Rockingham ranch. The rustlers had left clear tracks heading south, and Tom Miller had organized a posse to go after them. Grace heard the news from Martha, who came into town specifically to tell her. Blake went with them, Martha said, her face tight with worry. Tom insisted he stay behind, but Blake wouldn't hear of it, said they needed every man they could get. Grace felt fear clutch at her heart. When did they leave? Early this morning. Tom thinks they can catch up to the rustlers by tomorrow if they ride hard. Grace nodded, trying to hide her anxiety. They'll be careful, won't they? Martha squeezed her hand. Tom's not one to take foolish risks, and he won't let the others do so either. They'll be back before you know it. But 3 days passed with no word from the posse. Grace found it impossible to concentrate on her sewing, constantly moving to the window to look down the main street for any sign of riders returning. On the 4th day, just as dusk was falling, Grace heard the sound of horses approaching. She rushed to the window to see several riders coming slowly into town. Even from a distance, she could tell something was wrong. They were moving too slowly, and one horse appeared to be carrying 2 riders. Heart in her throat, Grace grabbed her shawl and hurried down the stairs and out into the street. A small crowd had gathered as the riders approached. In the fading light, Grace strained to see Blake among them. Tom Miller rode at the head of the group, his face grim. Behind him came 3 ranch hands, then the horse carrying 2 men, one upright in the saddle, supporting another who slumped against him. Blake, Grace whispered, recognizing the slumped figure even in the dim light. She pushed through the crowd as the riders stopped in front of the doctor's office. The ranch hand helping Blake carefully lowered him from the saddle into waiting arms. In the lamplight spilling from the doctor's window, Grace could see a dark stain spreading across Blake's shirt. Blake. She cried, rushing forward, Blake's head lifted at the sound of her voice. Grace, he murmured, his face pale with pain. What happened? She demanded, looking from Blake to Tom Miller. We caught up to the rustlers, Tom explained as they carried Blake inside. There was a fight. Blake took a bullet, protecting one of the younger hands. In the doctor's examination room, they laid Blake on the table. Dr. Warner, who had taken over Grace's father's practice after the fire, quickly cut away Blake's shirt to reveal an ugly wound in his left shoulder. The bullet's still in there, the doctor said after a brief examination. I'll need to remove it. Everyone out except Mrs. Miller, I need her assistance. Grace refused to move from Blake's side. I'm staying, she said firmly. Dr. Warner looked as if he might argue, then nodded. Very well. But stay out of the way. Grace moved to the head of the table and took Blake's right hand in hers. His eyes, glazed with pain, focused on her face. You shouldn't see this, he whispered. I'm not leaving you, Grace replied, squeezing his hand. I'll be right here. The procedure that followed was brutal but necessary. Dr. Warner gave Blake whiskey to dull the pain, then probed the wound to locate and extract the bullet. Blake's grip on Grace's hand tightened to the point of pain, but he didn't cry out, only a harsh groan escaping him when the doctor finally removed the bullet. You're lucky, Dr. Warner said as he cleaned and bandaged the wound. The bullet missed any vital areas. With proper rest and care, you should make a full recovery. When can he be moved? Grace asked. Not tonight, the doctor replied. He can stay here until morning. Then, if there's no sign of fever, he can be taken to the ranch. Grace shook her head. He's coming to my room. I'll care for him there. Dr. Warner frowned. Miss Nichols, that wouldn't be proper. I don't care about proper, Grace interrupted, a fierceness in her voice that surprised even her. He's my fiancé, and I'm going to take care of him. Tom Miller, who had remained in the room, spoke up. I'll make sure they have a chaperone, doctor. My wife can stay with them until Blake is well enough to return to the ranch. Dr. Warner still looked disapproving but didn't argue further. Very well, but he stays here tonight. He needs rest without being moved again. Grace nodded, not taking her eyes from Blake's face. His color was slightly better now that the bullet was removed, but he still looked alarmingly pale. I'll stay with him, she said. Grace, Blake murmured, his voice weak. You should rest. I'm not leaving you, she repeated, brushing his hair back from his forehead with gentle fingers. Martha Miller touched Grace's shoulder. I'll bring you some food and fresh clothes, and I'll be back in the morning to help move him. Grace nodded gratefully. Thank you. Throughout that long night, Grace sat by Blake's side, cooling his brow with a damp cloth when he grew feverish, helping him sip water when he woke, holding his hand through his restless sleep. In those quiet hours, watching the rise and fall of his chest, Grace confronted the depth of her love for this man and the terror of almost losing him. When morning came, Blake's fever had broken, and Dr. Warner reluctantly agreed he could be moved. With Tom and another ranch hand's help, they carefully carried Blake up the stairs to Grace's room and settled him in her bed. True to her word, Martha Miller moved in temporarily, bringing supplies from the ranch and setting up a cot for herself in the corner of Grace's small room. For the next week, the two women took turns tending to Blake, changing his bandages, preparing nourishing broths, and making sure he took the medicine Dr. Warner had prescribed. Blake was a difficult patient, constantly trying to get up before he was ready, insisting he needed to return to work. The house won't build itself, he argued on the fifth day, attempting to sit up despite Grace's protests. The house can wait, she said firmly, pressing him gently back against the pillows. Your health cannot. Gradually, Blake's strength returned. By the second week, he was able to sit up for longer periods, and by the third, he could walk slowly around the room. During his convalescence, many of the townspeople stopped by with gifts. Mrs. Collins from the general store brought freshly baked bread. Reverend Thompson came to pray with them, and even Dr. Warner visited daily, gradually warming to Grace as he observed her skilled and tender care of Blake. Only Harriet Wilson and her small circle of friends remained aloof, though Grace heard through Martha that they had been spreading rumors that Grace was trapping Blake by nursing him in her room. Nonsense, Martha had snorted when she told Grace. Anyone with eyes can see that man adores you. By the end of March, Blake was well enough to return to light duties at the ranch, though Dr. Warner strictly forbade him from doing any heavy lifting or riding for at least another 2 weeks. The rustlers who had shot Blake had escaped after the confrontation, but Marshal Jenkins from the next town over had sent word that 2 men matching their description had been captured trying to sell stolen cattle. Blake had to ride to identify them, a journey that worried Grace despite his assurances that he was fully recovered. I'll only be gone 3 days, he promised as he prepared to leave. And Tom is coming with me, Grace nodded, trying to hide her anxiety. Be careful. Blake drew her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that had grown during his recovery. I will. When I return, we'll set a date for the wedding. The house should be finished by the end of April. 3 days stretched into 5 with no word from Blake or Tom. Grace tried to keep busy with her sewing, but worry gnawed at her constantly. Had Blake's wound reopened during the journey? Had they encountered more rustlers on the road? On the 6th day, just as Grace was considering asking one of the ranch hands to ride out and look for them, she heard horses approaching. Rushing to the window, she saw Blake and Tom riding into town, both looking tired but unharmed. Grace flew down the stairs and out into the street, not caring who saw her undignified haste. Blake dismounted carefully and caught her in his arms as she ran to him. I was so worried, she said, holding him tightly. I'm sorry, Blake replied, stroking her hair. The marshal asked us to stay for the preliminary hearing. I would have sent word if there had been any way to do so. Later that evening, as they sat together in Grace's room, Blake told her about the identification and hearing. They were part of a larger gang, he explained. The marshal thinks the leader might be someone local, someone who knows the ranches in this area well enough to plan the raids. Local, Grace repeated, surprised. Who would do such a thing? Blake shook his head. The men wouldn't say. They're more afraid of their leader than they are of hanging. He took her hands in his, changing the subject. But I didn't come here to talk about rustlers. The house will be ready by the end of April, just as planned. What do you say to a May wedding? Grace's face lit up with joy. Yes, she said simply. May would be perfect. As April bloomed across the countryside, bringing wildflowers and fresh green grass, preparations for the wedding accelerated. Grace finished her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation of ivory silk with delicate embroidery around the neckline and cuffs. Martha Miller helped her with the final fittings, exclaiming over Grace's fine stitching. "You look beautiful," Martha said as Grace stood before the mirror in the completed dress. "Blake won't be able to take his eyes off you," Grace smiled, smoothing her hands over the silk. For once, when she looked in the mirror, she didn't see her scars. First, she saw a bride radiant with happiness and hope. The house was coming along beautifully. Blake took Grace to see it every Sunday, showing her the progress, the completed roof, the installed windows, the plastered walls. By the third week of April, the interior was nearly finished, with just the final touches remaining. "What do you think?" Blake asked as they stood in what would be their bedroom, looking out the window at the view of the creek and distant mountains. "It's more than I ever dreamed of having," Grace replied honestly. "It's perfect, Blake." He put his arm around her waist, drawing her against his side. "One more week of work and we can move in, and then on May 12th you'll be Mrs. Foster." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, savoring the moment and the promise of their future together. But their happiness was interrupted 3 days later when Grace heard shouting in the street outside the livery. She went to her window to see several ranch hands from the Rockingham riding hard into town, their faces grim, hurrying downstairs. Grace caught one of the men as he dismounted. "What's happened?" she asked, fear clutching at her heart. "Fire at the new house," the hand said, breathing hard. "Mr. Foster sent us to get help. He and Mr. Miller are trying to save what they can, but it's spreading fast." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. "I'm coming with you," she said, already moving toward the livery to saddle a horse. "Miss Nichols, it's not safe, I'm coming," she repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. The ride to their property seemed endless, though it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. Long before they arrived, Grace could see the column of black smoke rising into the clear spring sky. As they crested the final hill, the full devastation came into view. Their nearly completed house was engulfed in flames, the fire consuming the wooden structure with terrifying speed. Blake and Tom, along with several other ranch hands, were forming a bucket brigade from the creek, but it was clear their efforts were futile against the ferocity of the blaze. Grace slid from her horse and ran toward Blake, who was closest to the burning building, his face blackened with soot as he threw another bucket of water on the flames. "Blake," she called. He turned, his expression changing from determination to dismay when he saw her. "Grace, you shouldn't be here. It's not safe." "What happened?" she asked, ignoring his concern. Blake shook his head, his expression grim. "I don't know. Tom and I rode over this morning to work on the finishing touches. We smelled smoke as soon as we arrived and found the back of the house already burning." Tom Miller joined them, his face equally sooty. "It wasn't an accident," he said bluntly. "Someone set this fire deliberately. We found a broken lantern by the back door, and the grass had been cleared away to create a path for the fire to spread to the house." Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the spring breeze. "Who would do such a thing?" Blake's expression hardened. "The same people who have been rustling cattle, I'd guess. Someone who doesn't want us here." They stood watching helplessly as the flames devoured what should have been their new home. By the time the additional men from town arrived with more buckets and tools, it was too late to save the structure. All they could do was prevent the fire from spreading to the surrounding grassland and trees. As the last flames died down, leaving only smoking ruins, Grace felt a deep sense of déjà vu. Once again, fire had taken her home, her hopes for the future. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't alone in her loss. Blake stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his presence solid and reassuring. "We'll rebuild," he said quietly. "This doesn't change anything that matters." Grace looked up at him, seeing the determination in his soot-stained face. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." That evening, gathered in the Millers' ranch house, they discussed what had happened and what to do next. "You'll stay here until the house can be rebuilt," Martha insisted. "Both of you." Grace started to protest. It wouldn't be proper for her to stay at the ranch with Blake before they were married, but Tom cut her off. "You'll have separate rooms, of course," he said. "But Martha's right. After what happened today, I don't want either of you staying alone in town." Do you think whoever set the fire might try to harm us directly? Grace asked, the thought sending a chill through her. Blake and Tom exchanged a look that confirmed her fears before Blake answered. We can't rule it out. The fire was set in broad daylight, which suggests a certain boldness. Or desperation, Tom added. Marshall Jenkins believes the rustling gang is planning something big based on what the men they captured have said. Our interfering might have pushed them to take more drastic action. Blake took Grace's hand in his. We could postpone the wedding, he suggested reluctantly, until the house is rebuilt and this situation is resolved. No, Grace said firmly. I'm not letting whoever did this dictate our lives. We'll be married on May 12th as planned. Blake's expression softened with love and pride. Are you sure? Grace nodded. Absolutely sure. That night in the guest room Martha had prepared for her, Grace sat by the window looking out at the starlit landscape. The day's events had shaken her deeply, bringing back memories of the fire that had taken her family and left her scarred. But this time, the outcome would be different. This time, she wasn't alone and she wouldn't let fear dictate her future. A soft knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. Opening it, she found Blake standing there, his hair still damp from washing away the soot. I just wanted to check on you, he said softly, to make sure you're all right. Grace stepped back, inviting him in but leaving the door ajar in deference to propriety. I'm better than I expected to be, she admitted. Seeing the house burn was difficult. But I keep reminding myself that it's just a building. What matters is that no one was hurt. Blake sat down in the chair by the window, his expression troubled. I keep thinking about what might have happened if you had been there when the fire started, if we had been living there already. Grace knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. But I wasn't and we weren't, we're both safe. Blake brought her hands to his lips, kissing them gently. I couldn't bear to lose you, Grace, not when I've finally found you. You won't lose me, she promised. Whoever did this, whatever their purpose, they can't touch what matters most. They can't touch us. Blake's eyes searched her face, seeming to draw strength from her conviction. We'll rebuild, he said again, and in the meantime, we'll get married as planned. I don't want to wait any longer to make you my wife. Nor I to be your wife, Grace replied softly. The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Word of the fire spread quickly through Silverspring, and to Grace's surprise, many of the townspeople rallied to their support. Offers of help with rebuilding came from unexpected quarters, and donations of furniture and household goods appeared at the Miller's ranch almost daily. The wedding preparations continued, with Martha insisting they use the ranch house for both the ceremony and the celebration afterward. Reverend Thompson visited regularly, offering spiritual guidance and practical support. Through it all, Blake maintained a vigilant watch over Grace, never allowing her to go anywhere alone. The marshal had increased patrols in the area, but had found no concrete evidence linking the fire to the rustling gang or identifying the local collaborator Tom suspected. On the morning of May 12th, Grace woke early, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and lingering anxiety. Today, she would become Blake Foster's wife, a dream she had never dared to hope for after the fire that had scarred her body and her life. Martha helped her dress, arranging her hair in an elegant style that incorporated wildflowers rather than attempting to hide her scars. You look beautiful, Martha said, stepping back to admire her work. Truly beautiful. Grace turned to the mirror, seeing herself through new eyes. The woman who looked back at her was scarred, yes, but also radiant with happiness and love. This was who she was now, not defined by tragedy but transformed by it, made stronger and more compassionate by what she had endured. The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful. Blake, handsome in a new suit, waited for her in the Miller's parlor, which had been decorated with spring flowers. His face when he saw her walking toward him, escorted by Tom Miller, was everything Grace could have wished for: wonder, admiration, and overwhelming love. Dearly beloved, Reverend Thompson began, his voice carrying clearly to the small gathering of friends who had come to witness their union. As they exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever life might bring, Grace felt a sense of rightness, of coming home in a way that had nothing to do with physical buildings. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the Reverend declared. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Blake's kiss was gentle but full of promise, sealing their commitment before God and their community. As they turned to face their guests, now officially Mr. and Mrs. Foster, Grace saw genuine happiness in the faces around them, even in those who had once shunned her for her scars. The celebration afterward was joyful, with food and music and dancing in the miller's barn, which had been cleared and decorated for the occasion. Blake held Grace close during their first dance as husband and wife, his eyes never leaving her face. "Are you happy, Mrs. Foster?" he asked softly. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Grace replied, meaning every word. As the evening wore on, Grace noticed Harriet Wilson and two of her friends watching from the edge of the gathering, their expressions sour. They had not been invited but had apparently decided to come anyway. Blake noticed them too and stiffened slightly. "Ignore them," Grace said, placing her hand on his arm. "They can't touch our happiness today." Blake relaxed at her touch, his smile returning. "You're right, nothing can." Later, as the celebration was winding down, Blake and Grace prepared to leave for their wedding night. In lieu of their burned home, Tom Miller had arranged for them to stay in a small cabin on the far side of the ranch property, private, but still within safe distance of the main house. As they rode together in the wagon Blake had borrowed, the stars overhead and the soft spring breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers, Grace felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. "It's not the beginning we planned," Blake said as they approached the cabin, "but it's ours." "That's all that matters," Grace replied, leaning against his shoulder. The cabin was simple but had been prepared with care, fresh linens on the bed, a vase of wildflowers on the table, a fire laid ready in the small hearth. Blake carried Grace across the threshold, setting her gently on her feet in what would be their first home together, temporary though it might be. "Welcome home, Mrs. Foster," he said softly. "It's perfect," Grace replied, standing on tiptoe to kiss him, "because you're here." In the intimate privacy of their wedding night, Grace's remaining insecurities about her scars melted away under Blake's tender attention. His touch on the damaged skin was as reverent as on the smooth, his kisses as passionate. In his arms, she felt not just accepted but cherished, not despite her scars but wholly, completely as the woman she had become. Later, lying in the peace of their shared bed, Grace traced lazy patterns on Blake's chest, marveling at how far they had both come from their first meeting. "What are you thinking?" Blake asked, his fingers gently combing through her loose hair. "About the day we met," Grace replied. "How they laughed at me and you tipped your hat and saw beauty where they could only see scars." Blake's arm tightened around her. "I told you the truth that day. I did see beauty not just in your face, but in the way you held yourself with dignity despite their cruelty. You were the strongest, most beautiful woman I'd ever seen." Grace raised herself on one elbow to look into his face. "And you were the first person in 3 years to really look at me and see more than my scars." Blake pulled her down for a gentle kiss. "I'll always see you, Grace, all of you, that's my promise." As spring turned to summer, Blake and Grace settled into married life in the cabin while their new house was being rebuilt. The entire community had come together to help with the construction, even those who had once shunned Grace now offering their assistance. Grace continued her sewing work, expanding her business to include not just mending but creating new garments, particularly wedding dresses inspired by her own. Blake divided his time between his duties as foreman at the Rocking M and overseeing the rebuilding of their home. The investigation into the rustling gang and the fire continued, with Marshal Jenkins making regular visits to the area. In late June, there was a breakthrough when one of the captured rustlers finally named their leader in exchange for a reduced sentence. Tom Miller rode to the cabin one evening in early July, his expression grim as Blake invited him inside. "They've identified the leader of the rustling gang," Tom said without preamble, accepting a cup of coffee from Grace. "It's Wilson." "Wilson," Blake repeated, confused. "Harold Wilson, the banker," Tom nodded. "Apparently he's been in financial trouble for some time. The rustling operation was his way of making up the shortfall and keeping the bank afloat." Grace sat down slowly, her mind racing. "Harriet's father, but why target our house?" What did that have to do with cattle rustling? Tom looked uncomfortable. According to the man who confessed, the fire wasn't part of the rustling operation. It was personal. Blake's expression darkened. Personal? Harriet apparently ordered it, Tom said quietly. She paid one of the rustlers to set the fire. The man claims she was upset about your wedding. Grace felt a chill run through her. All those months of Harriet's coldness, the hateful glances, the whispered comments, it had gone far beyond simple dislike or jealousy. Have they been arrested? Blake asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Tom nodded. Marshal Jenkins arrested Harold Wilson this morning. Harriet was taken in for questioning about the fire. The marshal wants both of you to come to town tomorrow to give statements. After Tom left, Blake and Grace sat in silence for a long time, processing what they had learned. I knew Harriet disliked me, Grace said finally, but to go so far as to burn our house. Blake took her hand, his expression troubled. I never encouraged her, Grace, you must know that. Of course I know that, Grace assured him. This isn't about you or even about me, it's about her inability to see past herself and her own desires. Blake brought her hand to his lips. You're remarkable, you know that. Most people would be consumed with anger right now. Grace considered his words. I am angry, she admitted, but I also feel sad that someone could be so consumed by bitterness that they would try to destroy others' happiness. The next day, they rode into town together to give their statements to Marshal Jenkins. The news of the Wilsons' arrests had spread rapidly, and the town was abuzz with the scandal. As they passed the bank, now closed and under guard, Grace saw Martha Miller speaking with several women outside the general store. Grace, Blake, Martha called, waving them over. Have you heard the latest? They dismounted and joined the group, where Grace was surprised to receive sympathetic nods from women who had once avoided her. Heard what? Blake asked. Harold Wilson has been embezzling from the bank for years, one of the women, Mrs. Collins from the general store, explained. The marshal found records hidden in his office. Half the town's investments are gone. And Harriet has confessed to arranging the fire, Martha added. She's claiming it was just meant to delay the wedding, not destroy the house completely, but nobody believes that. Later, after giving their statements, Blake and Grace walked slowly down the main street of Silverspring. The town that had once been a place of painful memories for Grace now felt different, not because it had changed, but because she had. What are you thinking? Blake asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. That life takes strange turns, she replied. 3 years ago, after the fire, I thought my life was over. Now here I am, married to a wonderful man, rebuilding our home, finally accepted by the town that once shunned me. Blake smiled, squeezing her hand. And the woman who once tormented you is now facing justice. I don't take pleasure in their downfall, Grace said honestly, but I am glad the truth has come to light. By early August, their new house was nearly complete, larger and even more beautiful than the original, thanks to the combined efforts of so many willing hands. Blake had insisted on additional safety features, including a brick exterior that would be more resistant to fire. On the day they moved in, the entire community gathered to help them settle and to celebrate with a housewarming party. Grace, moving from room to room, arranging the gifts and furniture they had received, felt a deep sense of belonging that she had thought lost forever after the first fire. That evening, after the last guests had departed and they were finally alone in their new home, Blake pulled Grace into his arms in the center of their parlor. Welcome home, Mrs. Foster, he said, echoing his words from their wedding night. For real this time. Grace leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid strength of him, the safety and love he represented. Home is wherever you are, she replied softly. But this, she gestured around them, this is more than I ever dreamed of having again. Blake kissed her then, a kiss full of promise and shared dreams. We're just beginning, he whispered against her lips. The best is yet to come. 1 year later, Grace stood on the porch of their home, watching as Blake rode in from the fields, their son Daniel cradled securely in one arm. At 8 months old, Daniel was a happy, healthy baby with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. As Blake dismounted carefully, keeping the baby close, Grace felt her heart swell with love for them both. Blake had proven to be as wonderful a father as he was a husband, doting on their son and sharing equally in his care whenever his work allowed. "How are my two favorite people?" Blake asked as he climbed the porch steps, leaning in to kiss Grace. "We're perfect," Grace replied, taking Daniel into her arms. The baby immediately reached for her face, his tiny fingers patting her scarred cheek without hesitation or judgment. Blake watched them with a tender expression. "He's going to be as smart as his mother," he observed. "Already knows true beauty when he sees it," Grace smiled, bouncing Daniel gently as he began to fuss. "He's hungry. I'll feed him while you wash up for dinner." Inside their home, their real home, built with love and community support, Grace settled into the rocking chair by the window to nurse their son. As she gazed down at his perfect face, she marveled at how completely her life had transformed. The scars were still there, would always be there. But they had ceased to define her. Now they were simply part of her story, a story of loss and pain, yes, but also of survival, of love found in unexpected places, of beauty recognized by those with eyes to see. When Blake returned, freshly washed and changed, he stood in the doorway watching them for a long moment. "What?" Grace asked, noticing his gaze. "Just thinking about how lucky I am," he replied, coming to kneel beside her chair. "The day I saw you in town, surrounded by those laughing women, something told me you were special. I had no idea how special." Grace shifted Daniel to her shoulder, patting his back gently. "We were both lucky that day." Blake shook his head. "Not luck, providence." He reached out to stroke Daniel's downy head, then leaned in to kiss Grace softly. "I saw beauty that day, but what I found was so much more strength, courage, love, everything I never knew I needed until I found you." As the sunset painted their home in shades of gold, the small family sat together in contentment, their future stretching before them bright with promise and possibility. From the ashes of tragedy, they had built something precious and enduring, a love strong enough to see beyond scars, to recognize the beauty that comes not despite suffering but through it. And in the years that followed, as their family grew and their bond deepened, the story of the scarred girl and the cowboy who tipped his hat became a legend in Silverspring, a reminder that true beauty is seen not with the eyes but with the heart, and that love, real love, sees beyond the surface to the soul beneath.